Introducing the Director of Transformational Innovation for the U.S. Air Force, Camron Gorguinpour. The Director of Electric Transportation Development at the Energy Innovation Center at Southern Company, Randy Johnson. And CEQ Senior Sustainability Officer, Sarah Olexsak.
We're standing.
We're standing.
Hi. So thanks to the agenda setters for devoting the next few minutes to fleet electrification. EO 13693, the president there has placed an unprecedented priority on federal fleet electrification. For many agencies, the EV scale-up required by the EO also presents an unprecedented challenge. The Office of Federal Sustainability has made it a top priority to help agencies prepare to meet their EV passenger fleet acquisition targets. So what are those targets? Starting in FY17 fiscal year, fleets must increase the percentage of new passenger vehicle acquisitions that are electric vehicle to 20% by 2020 and 50% by 2025, sorry about that. This has us aiming for 500 to 600 new electric vehicle procurements in 2017. So we're going to need to work together to identify the process, technical expertise, best practices, and resources that agencies are going to need to meet these goals. Our session today will cover a discussion on the process from strategy formation to execution, and we present some innovative solutions coming out of Georgia, where the U.S. Air Force and Southern Company are working together to promote EV deployment. So on this stage here today, I have Randy Johnson, who's the Director of Electric Transportation Development at Southern Company's Energy Innovation Center. He serves on the board of directors for the Electric Drive Transportation Association, serves on Edison Electric Institute's Executive Electrification Task Force. So he's very, very engaged at the national level in the conversation about our transition to electric vehicles. Very important leadership role for this utility to take. Dr. Camron Gorguinpour is the Director of Transformational Innovation to the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisitions. Camron serves also as the Executive Director for DoD's PEV program, where he's responsible for executing large-scale, multi-year effort to integrate electric vehicles into the Defense Department's non-tactical vehicle fleet. So we're going to start off with a question about fleet and charging infrastructure assessment. So one of the first steps in procuring EVs is identifying which sedans and station wagons can be replaced with electric models. So in your view, what are the key elements that you're looking for in these EV-able vehicles? And we remember that our fleet electrification target really is covering currently the sedan station wagon category.
Well, so I'm a proponent for picking up the phone and calling the local fleet manager and asking, hey, how far do you drive these vehicles every day? And they'll tell you, and based on what they tell you, you can figure, an order of magnitude estimate of how many vehicles should be placed at any given facility. I think that one of the challenges in federal fleet adoption for EVs is this perspective that we have to hyperanalyze and get down to the exact 2 or 3 or 10 vehicles at every federal facility. And at the end of the day, especially when we're talking about commercially available EVs on the market today, we're talking about vehicles that have been sold in the tens and hundreds of thousands as I move forward. And at the end of the day, if you've never driven an EV, you should. I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler. You push the gas and it goes, you push the brake and it stops, you turn the wheel and it turns, you turn it the other way, it goes the other way. These aren't mystical, magical devices, these are cars. And so at the end of the day, a phone call to the fleet manager ought to be sufficient for you to figure out at a given facility which vehicles can be made electric, including a conversation of what can be plug-in hybrid versus fully electric. And in terms of figuring out where to place charging stations, that's maybe a little bit more complicated discussion because there are cost implications on where you put charging stations, and that's where we suggest working with your utility provider to help identify where those charging stations would be most cost effective.
Yeah, I would echo exactly what Camron just said. vehicles are very good vehicles. They're great. People are loving driving them. One of the things in the utility industry I think that we found is when we ask for it, we are sort of doing an apples and apples kind of thing. In other words, how many sedans do we have out there? And we do the same process. How far do they go? And I think that's great. I encourage people to go one step further. We also are a corporation that buys a lot of in bulk. So we do a lot of vehicles, like we buy a lot of trucks because that's just what we buy. I think this is a perfect opportunity to see, is that a good use of that vehicle? What we found is, hypothetically, if we buy 10 trucks, probably 8 of them need a truck. 2 of the people are just getting a truck because we're buying them, and we can replace that with a vehicle, and the driver's much more satisfied. So everything Camron just said, but I think it is an awfully good time to evaluate what is the vehicle doing, and do you have the right vehicle doing the job even before you start looking at electric versus anything else.
Can I just add one thing? I'm sorry. I've gotten a lot of feedback about the size of electric vehicles and the size of back seats. These things are incredible, the types of comments you get back. I can say that I have personally sat in the back seat of a Chevy Volt and a Nissan Leaf. And I'm a reasonably sized guy. I'm like 6'1", maybe like 190, so I'm not small. So perhaps if you were a giant, the back seat of an electric car might be too small for you, especially if you have a car full of giants. It can be crammed. But by and large, the car is a car. The back seat's a back seat. These are compact sedans, so they roughly have the size of a compact sedan.
You survived.
I did survive. Actually, it was rather comfortable.
I'm glad that you can make it here with us.
The question is, how far did you go?
A bit. It was my sister-in-law's car, but my brother was driving, so that gives you a good sense of the tolerance of the cars. Anyhow. Yeah.
So you kind of mentioned some of the things about the charging infrastructure side of things. When you're in the position of developing a fleet electrification program at your facility, and you're starting to think about the types of charging station attributes, what level of charging station? Should I get a networked station or a non-networked station? So many different attributes that you need to think about. It can start to be a really overwhelming decision-making process when you're first trying to start this program up. So what have you learned that can help make this process easier for a fleet manager at a facility who's just starting to think about installing charging infrastructure?
Randy, you want to go?
I think, just following up on the conversation with the right vehicle for the right task, I think infrastructure is exactly that. I think a lot of times when people are looking at infrastructure, they kind of get focused on one thing. Do I want all level 2 and some consistency? And I think the important thing is, if you have plug-in electric vehicles, that have a smaller battery, if you have, battery electric vehicles with a larger battery, and your facility's old, look at all of those things, but don't be afraid to look at level 1 charging. If you have plug-ins and people are going to be there for a long time, especially if it's workplace type charging. Level 2, obviously, is good. And I would say don't shy away from DC fast charging if you have a vehicle that will do it, and you can replace maybe one fast charger could replace maybe 15 or 20 level 2 charges. I do think it comes to economics, but it comes to economics and the type vehicles that you have, and I think it's very important to match that. I think networking is also a thing people need to look at. Very big proponent of networking. It gives you so much data, a lot about the car, but make sure you need it. If you have a fleet and you're just parking the fleet and they charge at night, you probably have all the metrics from the car itself or your fleet manager. You may not necessarily need all those bells and whistles of a network. If you don't need it, don't do it, because it will certainly cut price back. And I think that's one of the things you have to look at. Do you need a network? Do you need level 1, level 2, or DC? Yeah,
I agree with Randy, and I would. What I've seen a lot of out in, at least within DoD, I'm assuming the same is true generally across the federal fleet. With a low rate of electric vehicle adoption, it's really, really hard to make a strong business case for installing charging stations, because, like anything, it's a volume proposition that if you install a charging station, you have multiple vehicles using that station, it's more economical than in the sort of the onesies and twosies scattered around that are hardly being used. So I'm a proponent for aggregating charging stations and vehicle allocations on common facilities. We've been talking with Southern Company quite a bit about coupling that approach of aggregating larger numbers of vehicles on bases with cleverly locating DC fast charging stations near but not on federal facilities, so that the public can share access to those level 3 stations. And we believe there's a positive business model for private investment in charging infrastructure simply by focusing on how we allocate our vehicles.
That's a good segue to my next question. So electric vehicles themselves present a higher upfront cost compared to comparable gasoline engine vehicles, and they also require agencies to fund the charging infrastructure. Earlier this year, GSA negotiated an exceptional bulk purchase deal with Ford that eliminated the incremental cost for vehicles in certain states. GSA has also agreed to leverage $33 to $40 million of its ASF capital reserves to help agencies overcome upfront barriers to acquiring charging stations and electric vehicles from FY16 to FY18. GSA's government-wide blanket purchase agreement for charging infrastructure will also help streamline the acquisition process for charging stations. What are some of the other solutions for overcoming procurement barriers that you're thinking about? Randy, can you speak to how an agency might use their utilities' GSA area-wide agreement for charging infrastructure? Camron, how has the Air Force navigated this process?
I'll let Camron kind of talk a little bit more about the GSA. He's probably much more astute at that, but I would come back to, as one of those things you'll hear me comment about probably with every question, always talk to your utility. You never, ever know what's going on. There are some utilities, as we've all heard, some utilities are very involved and some utilities are not as involved. But the utility will know, do they have, does the state have any incentives? Does the utility have any incentives? Are there workplace charging programs that are out there that the utility's promoting? All of those kinds of things are there. Is the utility trying to move this market along and looking for opportunities for optics? That's a great thing with federal government. If people see these cars going, the utility might be very encouraged to say, hey, let's partner on this so that you're making the market so more comfortable. I think in those situations, you always talk to them. I think your key customers, federal government is always a key customer of utilities. And utilities are always going to want to work very hard with the federal government. So there's maybe opportunities there that you haven't thought of and that the utility may want to partner with you. And I think one of the things we've partnered with DOD is taking a little bit of a creative approach with the infrastructure and using the area-wide. So I'll let Cameron speak about that a little bit more.
Yeah, so on vehicle costs are coming down. You mentioned the GSA pilot, and now there's soon to be, if not already, another low-cost option on a GSA schedule for fully electric sedans. So I think that the vehicle cost issue is gradually becoming a non-issue. I do think that infrastructure is, well, that and the size of the back seats. Infrastructure is becoming probably the central issue. And so probably about half of federal facilities in the continental United States have their utilities provided, electrical utilities provided through a GSA area-wide agreement. And those are very flexible contracting vehicles that you can add addenda onto. And so the idea of using an area-wide agreement is the agency forms a partnership with the local utility, assuming the utility is willing, where the utility pays for the installation of charging infrastructure and recoups their cost based on the guaranteed volume usage of federal fleet vehicles. And so what we're negotiating with Southern is to implement a business model like that, using the GSA area-wide agreement to include, as I mentioned before, off-site DC fast charging stations. And again, accessibility from the public to use those stations improves the business case for Southern. So I'm not one who believes that the federal government necessarily has to have a line item budget for installation of thousands of charging stations. I think that there are clever public-private partnerships that can and should be explored and executed that leverage private investment based on our guarantee of fleet volume.
I was going to say, for those in the audience, I don't want to overhype this too much, but I believe that it's been great to have you guys here today, because this is, just to let you know, really an unprecedented relationship between a utility and a federal agency using this area-wide agreement for this purpose. So it's something that your agencies want to start thinking about. These guys are good to talk to think about how we can be doing this, so keep going.
No, I was just going to say, everything was Cameron was talking about, but a lot of utilities and a lot of federal agencies have been doing energy efficiency and some solar programs under the GSA area-wide, this is the same issue. So sometimes you don't necessarily draw an immediate line to, I can do that, but it's still electrical, it's still working, it's still a process. So I think most of you probably have experience with energy efficiency and maybe some solar programs. Just include this.
Yeah, I'd say, and again, I don't want to put GSA on the hook. I mean, I kind of do, but I don't really. I shouldn't. But those area-wide agreements are so flexible, EVs aside. If you're looking at a potential partnership with an electrical utility or other utility under the area-wide agreement, those vehicles are incredibly flexible.
So as was mentioned earlier, we had a GreenGov dialogue on fleet electrification, and the purpose of this conversation is to present some of those highlights. The Federal Energy Management Program is also very, very involved in leadership when it comes to fleet electrification and charging infrastructure. They're a really good resource to be going to for training and resources about charging infrastructure. So another common challenge that we hear from fleet managers is that the drivers or passengers say they won't like EVs. We talked about that a little bit earlier. In contrast, GSA conducted an online survey of all the drivers that participated in the GSA EV fleet pilot a few years ago. They said they received feedback from 70 customers and learned that there was an 82% satisfaction rate, and 88% said that charging their electric vehicles was easy. So Randy, any thoughts on what's going on here? You're kind of looking at this from the national level. Is it a matter of you've got to try the electric vehicles to like it? And what are some of the ways that the folks in this room, the agency headquarters, can get their fleet managers and drivers on board with EVs?
Yeah, this is, if everyone has people have a soapbox, this is sort of my soapbox. I have been doing this for probably 6 or 7 years, probably since 2009, right before the Leaf came out, right before the Volt came out. And one of the things at that point was, how do you get education and awareness? How do you educate people on these vehicles? And it still, in 2016, is a major, major issue because so many people, most people, have not had access to electric vehicles when you look at where they've been sold and what's been going on with them and the percentage of the market. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about them. People think the electric vehicles are still the electric vehicles of the late 90s and early 2000s, and there's some negative connotations there. People think of them as golf carts. People think of them as the neighborhood thing. And as Camron said, please, these are not that. If you look at a Tesla and you get in a Tesla, you're going to leave the get up and go, the technology. These are amazing vehicles. But I think the big deal is people just don't know. We had the same problem with our line crew foreman. We put them in some electric vehicles and there was some resistance until they had them for about a week. And I'm not exaggerating, now they wouldn't give them up. They absolutely love them. So the challenge is educating people on the type of car, how far we'll go, range anxiety, but the main thing is the technology, the get up and go, and basically maintenance free. But getting, pardon the pun, but butts in the seat is the only way to do it. I mean, once people get into the vehicle and drive it around, we found that 80 or 90% of people just have a complete change of opinion. So I would say work with your utilities and see if your utility has vehicles that they could loan you for a ride and drive. Talk to some of the OEMs with doing that because they're very big with that. But I think you get someone in the car, you will get those same kind of 80 to 90% numbers. It's just getting them in it.
When you put the blinker on to the left, it blinks to the left, and then when you put it right, it blinks to the right. The vehicles are just vehicles. Now, you got to worry about range and, understand the limits of how far you can go on a given day. But that's the part of the fleet manager on the facility is to make sure that the right vehicle is assigned for the right use. But by and large, and I've been fortunate through my role to have driven all manner of electric vehicles, from the golf carts to commercially available sedans to, I once drove an electric UPS truck about 70 miles an hour down the freeway, which was interesting. So I've driven a lot of these things, and by and large, they drive like vehicles. I mean, it's the boringest demonstration ever because you get in the car and you drive it in a circle. You're like, okay, well, it's a car. So yeah, I agree. Folks just need to understand that this is not substantively different than any other regular car.
What we hear a lot is that after people drive an electric vehicle, not just on a test drive, but for a couple of months, and then they get back in an internal combustion engine vehicle, and their life has changed, and they say, I feel like I'm riding in a lawnmower. It is loud, it's noisy, it smells, and when you can get an electric vehicle and it's driving the technology of the future today, and it's here. So one of the other things that the executive order asks for, EO 13693, is not just the fleet electrification target, but a GHG per mile reduction. And we really think, I think at CEQ, that without electric vehicles, our agencies are not going to have as easy of a job at meeting this GHG per mile goal. So lastly, before we have a couple questions, maybe from the audience, we always hear that successful fleet electrification projects can't survive without a champion. Camron, I know that you have been a significant champion at the Air Force, and we talked about how you'll be leaving eventually, soon-ish. Hopefully you'll be here for a while.
I get kicked out at the end of the administration.
You know something we don't?
Well, at this administration, you know, so how are we looking at those in the room to find organizations, leaders within today to help create the champion if one doesn't already exist? What are the attributes that fleet managers need to look for, and how do they be champions themselves?
Well, first of all, you know, there's nothing magical about me that put me in charge of looking at electric vehicles for the Defense Department. So the story was, I started in the Air Force in 2010, October 2010. A month on the job, my boss, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, ends up in a meeting on electric vehicles with Army, Navy, and Department of Energy. And DoD wanted to do something. They didn't have anybody that wasn't already busy, and I was only there for a month. I have a PhD in something technical, not electric vehicles. And so they said, oh, well, Camron, you know, PhD, fine. And so, you know, there was nothing about me that led to me figuring out, okay, this is what needs to be done. And I would say the same of anybody in the audience or anybody that you might talk to. It helped, obviously, to have leadership support for the work that I was doing. But all the answers are out there. There's no shortage of answers on what vehicles are available, what charging stations are available, what are the best practices for selecting which vehicle and selecting which charging stations. All that information's there if you look for it. I would say probably the one thing that I still feel is understudied is the business models. That making this cost-effective in a real way requires some serious thought and consideration with industry, both on the utility side and on the vehicle manufacturing side, and that's difficult. So if I could leave you with one question remaining to be answered, is how do you actually make this easy to execute from a contracting perspective in a way that gets you to cost parity with conventional vehicles? And again, I think with the conversations we've been having with Southern and a few other things we've been doing, I think we're close to getting there, but I definitely think that's an area that needs further thought.
Randy, any comments on what you've seen is when you look at the private sector and you see the fleets that have electrified and the workplace charging, another subject that's taken off, what has it taken in those organizations to make that happen from a leadership perspective?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I'll look at it from sort of a utility perspective because I've been spending a lot of time trying to get more utilities involved in promoting and understanding electric transportation. And, you know, we get caught up on fun to drive, great cars, we get caught up on environmental, we get caught up on a lot of things that we hear, but I think one of the things that we don't do a good enough job is looking at the organization's goals and fitting or demonstrating how an electric vehicle can help that organization achieve those goals. Is it fuel cost? Is it an environmental thing? Is it for a utility additional, growth when energy is stagnant or going negative? So I would say if you want to champion, understand the vehicles and demonstrate how the vehicles help that organization achieve its goals. And I think that is a lot easier than most people recognize. We all have energy savings goals. We all have grid modernization goals that this might help at some point. We all have those goals. So I think finding how it works, then you'll find your champion.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I know that we were going to open it up for some questions. I think we have a minute or two left.
Sarah. So Jim, right there, second row.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, separate but parallel issue, if you would. Every time I mention to people we have a fleet vehicle, they go, "Oh, cool! I want to plug in my Chevy Volt." And we had to lock all the outlets in the parking garage to keep people from plugging in their Chevy Volts. And as soon as we get a charging station, I'm going to get 10 more emails that says, as soon as you pull out, can I pull in? And I know there's the cost of paying for the electricity, and I don't know if any of that's been resolved because we would like to start a program.
So my name's Sarah Olexsak, and I also, in addition to fleet electrification, live and breathe federal workplace charging. So even though that wasn't the topic of this panel today, I would like to announce that in October we'll be having a half-day workshop on federal workplace charging. So find me, we'll give you a card, and we'll resolve all of those questions there next month. But in the meanwhile, we can also talk.
Can I put a little bit of
Yeah,
a spin
sure,
on
go
this?
ahead.
So if you know that a good portion of your workforce at a given facility has electric vehicles and would like to charge, and you know that you have some fleet vehicles that are there or soon to be there, that just screams out to try and form some sort of public-private partnership to have somebody else pay for the installation of charging stations that your fleet vehicles can use. It might have to be off-site, maybe not, just depends, but that's an opportunity in my view.
I would say exactly the same thing as I mentioned earlier. Talk with your utility. A lot of utilities have workplace charging programs out there where they're encouraging people to sort of walk the talk, for lack of a better word, and they help. If not, a lot of the OEMs also have workplace charging programs. That's a very important piece. Common problems, but very important, and I think Sarah can help you kind of do through some of those.
One more minute. Any other questions from the audience? So go ahead.
What is the environmental impact on used batteries?
The environmental impact on used batteries, well, it depends on what you do with them. We haven't been directly, but we've been tangentially involved in various studies related to second life battery use. When a battery for a vehicle is no longer functional for that battery, it still has a lot of potential service life left. So there's a lot of research into how do you take those vehicle batteries, put them into a stationary resource, and really drive the battery down to end of life. At the end of life, I'm not up on all the literature on recycling of batteries, but I know that's an active area of research.
Yeah. The Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy recently, last year, did a study, cradle to grave, on just that topic. So I would love to be able to send you a link afterwards. And what they found is that electric vehicles still come out better than internal combustion engine vehicles when you consider cradle to grave, well to wheels.
One thing about that is I think we'll know more. It's a little plug for electric vehicles. We will know more, but the batteries so far in these vehicles have been so good that we've had very little replacement. So we've had very little of that. They're going a lot further than people thought they would go. They're a lot just better quality than we thought. So we'll know more about that, but I think it's going to be probably 5 to 8 years from now before we have to even deal with some of that.
Thank you so much, Randy and Cameron. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.